Well, good folks, it is so good to be with all you good folks here tonight. I've looked forward to this, and I really appreciate the invitation. I had Steve in my Greek class, had Casey as well, and I count these as good friends, and I appreciate these good men, and I know you do as well. I heard about a mother who invited some folks over for supper. And when they were gathered around the table, she asked her little 6-year-old daughter to say a little prayer of thanks for the food. And she said, well, Mother, I don't know what to say. So her mother said, well, just say what I say. And so she said, okay. And so the little girl bowed her head in a sweet little innocent, sincere voice, and she prayed, and she said, Lord, why on earth did I invite all these people for supper tonight? You know, you may have felt that way too, because hospitality is not always easy in our busy world. There's a story about a preacher who was a very hospitable sort of guy, and he would always go visit people in his church every Saturday morning. So this Saturday morning, he is out visiting people, knocking on doors and seeing folks, and he came to one house where it was obvious that somebody was home. The lights were on. There was a car in the driveway, so he knew somebody was home, and so he knocked several times, but nobody came to the door. So after a while, he took out a card, and he wrote on it, Revelation 3:20 on the back, and then he stuck that card in the door. Now, Revelation 3:20 reads like this, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come to him and dine with him, and he with me. Well, the next day, Sunday, the card he left turned up in the collection plate. And then it was passed along to the preacher. And right below what the preacher wrote was another scriptural reference. It was Genesis 3:10. It said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. So, you know, hospitality can be a problem sometimes. Even when we mean well, it can be a problem for us. You know, hospitality is a lot of work. It's often inconvenient. It ruins your schedule. It's an invasion of your privacy in some ways. It may not even be enjoyable. And I suspect that sometimes we even complain about having to show hospitality and be doing hospitality for someone. Mark Twain said this. He said, guests always bring joy. Some when they arrive and then some when they leave. Well, I think he's on to something there. Ben Franklin, being the wise man he was, said that guests and fish start to smell after 3 days. Sounds like he's on to something too. Well, let's take a quick look tonight at the fascinating subject of hospitality. I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear the word hospitality. But when I hear the word hospitality, I think about a table filled with chocolate chip cookies and a big pot of coffee brewing and maybe even a cup of tea. But it brings those kind of memories to our minds when we think about hospitality. And enjoying food with family and friends is just a good thing. It creates good memories for us. But the biblical concept of hospitality is a lot deeper and a lot more significant even than that. There were 5 types of hospitality in the ancient Mediterranean world. The first type of hospitality was called public hospitality. This was practiced by countries and states as a part of their foreign policy. And the way this worked was when a person came from a country, visiting another country, and they experienced some hospitality and strong alliances were formed between families. And when there were political problems or things needed to be taken care of, they would go to this person. And in our day and time, we have ambassadors that will go to the country, or they are in the country, and they can settle the problems. But in these days, in the ancient world, bonds of friendship and hospitality served that same purpose. The second type of hospitality in the ancient world was temple hospitality. This was the kind of hospitality that would be given to pilgrims who were traveling to different religious sites. For example, in Greece, if they were traveling to Delphi or Delos or some of these other religious places where the temples were, they would have inns and houses where people could come and stay, and they could visit the temples and see all the religious things around. The third type of hospitality in the ancient world was commercial hospitality. And this was hospitality where travelers paid for their own food and lodging. As the Roman Empire grew stronger and stronger, it built an incredible system of roads and highways. And because of the ease of travel, more and more people were out traveling and going places, and so there was a need for inns and hostels to be built, usually about every 10 miles. And so these would be places where people could go to stay, but some were good, but most of them were not ideal, especially for Christian travelers. Many of these inns were dirty. Many of them were kind of like rough houses, really. And for the price of your room, usually a prostitute would be thrown in as a part of that price. And so there were other dangers, such as robbery and murder and other things going on. So there were a lot of reasons why these inns were not good places for Christians to go. And then there was another type of hospitality called divine host hospitality or divine guest hospitality. This is hospitality where the host did not know that the person they were serving was a divine being. And often these divine beings would come and they would be disguised or they would be unrecognizable to the host. For example, there are many stories in classical literature of heavenly beings being entertained, and the host did not know that they were, gods or who they were. They were given food and shelter and protection and all of that, and they didn't know that they were divine beings. One of the most famous stories in classical literature is the story of Baucis and Philemon. The gods Jupiter and Mercury went to this village, and they were seeking hospitality. And they would go from place to place, and every house they went to, they were treated terribly. And the people were just so ugly and mean-spirited toward them, and they kind of threw them out and had nothing to do with them, would give them nothing until they came to the home of an old couple, very poor, destitute people. And these people welcomed these gods in and gave them the very best they had. And even though they had not much food, they sacrificed what they had for these divine beings. Well, the story goes that they gave an immense reward to this old couple, a huge mansion, fabulous wealth. And then they went down through the village and killed everybody in the village. So that is a type of hospitality. And it's a similar story in the Old Testament, as we would know, and you may have already thought about, Abraham. Abraham showed hospitality to some men, not knowing that they were, I guess, angels, you might say. And there's another story of Lot, who entertained some people there in Sodom. He didn't know. He thought they were men, but they were really angels. And so this is a type of hospitality that we see and encounter in the ancient world. A fifth type of hospitality is private hospitality. And this was the hospitality that was widely practiced in the ancient Mediterranean world and was seen as a moral virtue. It was seen as something that good people do. It was seen as something we do to help other human beings. It was seen as something that would be typical of people of culture and people of generosity. And so this individual type hospitality is the type of hospitality I want to talk with you about tonight most of the time. Originally, the practice of hospitality was linked to the bestowal of hospitality on strangers, but then later on it came to be applied to friends and people who knew each other. Often in the ancient world, hospitality cemented and bonded people together. And of course, there was always the expectation of reciprocal hospitality. In other words, if you showed me hospitality, then if I did it to you, I expected you to do it in return to me. And so these bonds of friendship that was focused around hospitality were so strong that even the descendants of people who had been shown hospitality were bound by obligations of friendship. It's interesting that both Greek and Roman travelers, when they went out someplace, would carry what they call tokens of hospitality. It would be some little something that the host that had entertained them had given them. It may be a coin or some emblem of the family. And they took these with them when they traveled, so that that they would show that even some of the descendants, the children of the grandfathers and the fathers, had shown hospitality, and they were coming through, and this was a way to show that they deserved some hospitality as well. Well, despite the widespread growth of commercial hospitality in the ancient world, private hospitality was widely practiced, and it was common for people to write letters of recommendation for friends who were traveling to other places. And these letters would commend the travelers and would request hospitality and other favors for them as they travel. The classical place to see that in the New Testament is Romans 16. And here we see Paul writing a commendation for Phoebe. You remember Phoebe was the deaconess at Cenchrea. And evidently she is carrying Paul's letter that he's written to the Romans. She is carrying that letter to Rome. And Paul is writing, as he writes to that church, he adds this little note about Phoebe. And he says, take care of this woman, show her hospitality. He said, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and give her any help she may need from you. She has been a great help to many people, including me. And so this is just a little snippet of a recommendation that he's making for Phoebe. Another longer recommendation is the letter to Philemon, we call Philemon. And it's really a letter of recommendation for him, for this person. Well, these were typical in the ancient world. When we look at the Old Testament, hospitality is something that is really important to the alien, the resident alien, or the stranger who is among them. And it's even more important to show respect to these resident aliens than it is even to your own neighbors. That's how strong it was in that culture toward outside people. In the Torah, hospitality is commanded at least 24 times, so it's important. And the Eastern cultures today still value hospitality as a primary virtue. We have lots of examples from the Old Testament about hospitality. I've already touched on Abraham. Abraham in Genesis 18 was a generous and attentive host. He opened his home to these men who came through, and he had an animal slaughtered for them. He had fine food cooked up for them, and there's a little point I hadn't noticed before, but he stands while they eat. He's like a waiter, I guess, and he's there while they're being served, and Abraham is standing there waiting to take care of these men that have come to his home. And the reason he does it is because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because in that culture you showed hospitality. There are others noted for their hospitality. Melchizedek in Genesis 14. Rebekah, Genesis 24. The prostitute Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. The Shunammite woman in 2 Kings who shows this extreme hospitality to Elisha when he comes through. So there are numbers of models of hospitality from the Old Testament. But I also noticed there are some good examples of inhospitality in the Old Testament. And one that I think of right off the top of my head is Jael. You remember Jael? This enemy commander comes to her tent seeking refuge. And the rule was if you found refuge in somebody's tent or their house, you had to take care of them. Well, she's not very hospitable, is she? She drives a tent peg through his brain, you know. So a good example of inhospitality. But another one that kind of grabbed me a little bit was the story over in 1 Samuel 25 with Nabal. You remember Nabal? Nabal is a rich man. He's got all kinds of animals and wealth, and David is kind of on the run. And so David sends some of his men to Nabal to ask for some provisions, to ask for some food, for some supplies, and Nabal is just insulting. I mean, I guess that's the right word to use. He is just totally insulting. He really says that David is kind of a scoundrel. David gets mad when his men get back and tell him. And David has 400 men. He got 600. He leaves 200 behind, and he brings 400, and he's going to go out and kill everybody in Nabal's house. But there's a beautiful woman in that house named Abigail. Smart wife, beautiful wife. Later becomes one of David's wives after Nabal dies. But she's smart, and she comes out, and she gets all the food and provisions and everything she can and meets David on the road. And she talks to David and talks him out of going down there and killing everybody. Well, lack of hospitality almost got a whole family killed. When we look at the New Testament, Jesus, I think, is the greatest example of hospitality. Jesus was the generous host feeding 5,000 people. Let me ask you this. What if 5,000 people showed up on your doorsteps tonight and they're hungry, they want food now? What would you do? Well, Jesus took care of them. He's the generous host. And then he is the host at the Lord's Supper. I mean, at the Last Supper. You know, he's there hosting the disciples. And who can forget, I think, one of his greatest parables in Luke 10 about the man who was going down the road and he was beaten by the robbers, and this Samaritan comes through. And he shows incredible hospitality. That's what the story is really about. And he takes this guy down to this inn, and he says, I'm going to leave this guy with you. Take care of him. I'll be back through here later on, and when I do, I'll pay you. And I don't know how long that would have been. Maybe a few weeks, a few days, or maybe a few months. I don't know. He was beaten up pretty badly. But this guy is going to show enough care for that man that he's just going to pay his bill no matter what it is. Well, that's hospitality. Of keen interest to me is Matthew 25. And I think sometimes we overlook Matthew 25 in terms of hospitality, because when we look at Matthew 25, we think of it in terms of the judgment. And, all the people of the world are going to be judged there by Jesus. And we have that great judgment scene. But you know what that passage is about? It's about hospitality. It's written all over that text. And notice in here that Jesus says basically the same thing to the ones on the right, and he says that he says to the left. I'm going to start in verse 41, what he says to the left. He says, and he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. See, this is the language of hospitality. And evidently, you and I are going to be judged on whether we do or do not show hospitality. That's going to be part of it, folks. And so I guess the question we need to raise up and maybe use this as a kind of a test case for our own lives, are we hospitable people? Because I guarantee you this is going to be a part of it when we gather there before the Lord on that great judgment day. We can't help but see as we look at these texts that in the ancient Mediterranean world, hospitality was of supreme importance. And by the way, this hospitality was such a rich tradition among the Jews. It was in the DNA of these Jews to show hospitality. It was just a part of who they were. It was ingrained in them to show hospitality. And for that reason, I do not think that the usual interpretation of Jesus being born in a drafty barn somewhere, in some lonely, cold, dank barn, is correct. And by the way, there are a few details in that story we might need to notice. Joseph was a descendant of David. Joseph was of the house of David. If someone coming into town claiming to be of the house of David, you think they would be turned away? You think they'd be turned down? And Bethlehem was the city of David. incidentally. So the tradition about Jesus being born in an old barn someplace is way off base. And so call me later in the year, around Christmas time, if you want to, and I'll give you the rest of the story. To reject Jesus and not show hospitality to him would have been the essence of inhospitality. It would have been the essence of an insult, not to bring in a descendant of David into the house someplace. Well, anyhow, when we look at Acts, we see not only there earlier what Jesus has done with hospitality, but in Acts, hospitality. Luke is full of hospitality. I don't even have time to go through all what Luke's gospel says about it, but in Acts, we have such people as Cornelius and Lydia, who, after their conversions, show hospitality. We also see the incredible hospitality of the Jerusalem church in Acts 2:44 through 47. Here's what the text says. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to everyone as he had need. Folks, that's hospitality. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. So here's a model for hospitality going all the way back to the early church. When we look at Paul, a quick survey there tells us that for Paul, hospitality was a key Christian virtue. A key Christian virtue. Paul saw that hospitality was a way to promote unity in the church. So look at Romans 14 and 15. And this was a way to meet the needs of others. In Romans 12 and 13, Paul said, share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Now, this is not a suggestion, folks. This is a command. It's in command language. Practice hospitality. You know, Paul depended on hospitality. 1 Corinthians 9, he talks about some of his travels and troubles, and being able to have hospitality was a means for him to spread the gospel. And for Paul, hospitality was one of the fundamental expressions of the gospel and basic, I'm telling you folks, basic to Christian living. So what am I saying? What are you saying, Paul? Here's what I'm saying. This, Paul. Hospitality is not optional. You may say, man, it's just so much fun. I don't even like food. I'm not going to be a hospitable person. I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to show hospitality. Well, listen, let me give you a little news flash. Hospitality is not optional. It's not optional. And there are numerous places that we can go to where hospitality is commanded of Christians. Not a suggestion, but it is commanded of Christians. In his later writings, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, we see a more narrow focus by Paul on hospitality. And we see it in terms of the qualification of elders. It's interesting when we look at 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:8, that hospitality is one key indicator of an elder's fitness to serve the church. And so I'm an elder, and we have elders here. And I'm talking to myself that this is a requirement of me as an elder in the Lord's church that I be a hospitable person. In 1 Timothy 5, we have the widows. We have women in the church who have no family to take care of them, and they're going to be having to meet some qualifications in order to be able to receive help from the church. And you know what one of those qualifications was? Just guess. A wild guess? Hospitality. Yeah. So this is important. You know, I jumped to the Johannine epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And I find these texts to be really interesting. And I wish we had a lot more time to talk about these texts, but I'm just going to kind of dive into it in a brief sort of way. But when I look at especially 2nd and 3rd John, we see in these texts the important role that hospitality played in the spread of the gospel. Traveling evangelists could not do their work. They could not do what they needed to do without good Christian families taking them in, giving them a place to stay, giving them a little food, and then sending them on their way. Jesus counted on this when he sent out his disciples. You remember there in Matthew 10 and Luke 10, he counts on people taking those men in and giving them hospitality. Now, in the late first century, that's when 2nd and 3rd John are set. We're looking at the end of the first century. When we get to the end of the first century, we find there is a concern about how to tell the difference between a true prophet and a false prophet. There are a lot of people coming through town looking for hospitality. And you don't know if they're a true prophet or a false prophet. And so the problem is that some of these traveling missionaries and teachers and preachers were bringing false doctrine. And some of these men were out and out con men. And so the church is vulnerable to such influences. And so we see in 2nd and 3rd John how dependent traveling missionaries were, as I've said earlier, on the generosity of other Christians to help them to spread the gospel and have a place to stay. In 2nd John, those who do not bring the orthodox teaching about Christ are not to be given hospitality. John lays it down clearly. If they don't bring the accurate biblical teaching about Christ, you don't give them hospitality. In 3rd John, we have it even more revealing here about this when John praises Gaius for showing hospitality to the faithful itinerant preachers, even those who were strangers, but he strongly chastises, you remember Diotrephes? Diotrephes resisted not only the teaching of John, but he also resisted the traveling missionaries and teachers that John had sent out. So 3rd John is really an interesting text, and both of these are, in terms of hospitality. And so the problem of who was a false teacher and who was not, and who to show hospitality to or not to show hospitality to, was a big issue facing the church in the late 1st century and afterwards, in the 2nd century and 3rd century. The Didache was written in the early 2nd century. It was written around the year 115 AD. And this short text addressed the problem of these false teachers who are going around and others who are going around and proposes some tests. So here are some tests. If somebody comes to you wanting hospitality, here are some tests that you go through to see if they are good men or bad men. One test was you find out, and you listen to them, and find out if their teaching and their doctrine is orthodox, if it's biblical. That's the first thing. The second thing that the Didache says as a test is that their stay had to be strictly limited. In other words, if these traveling teachers came by your house and wanted your hospitality and they stay more than 2 days, if they stay more than 2 days, that's a sign that they are a heretic and not a true follower of God. You see, these people lived on the edge. They lived from hand to mouth. They barely had enough to feed their own families, and you got some guy coming through, or 2 or 3 guys coming through, eat you out of house and home and stay a week. See, that won't work. And maybe this is a good rule today. Folks come to see you. You stay 2 days, 2 days you're gone. I'm just joking. Don't do that. Well, 2 days and you're gone. A third test that we find in the Didache is that they were to be sent on their way after they got there, visiting and everything. You send them on the way with some supplies, help them out the best you can to go to the next town or wherever, but you don't give them any money. Supplies, but not money. And then a fourth test was they were not to use their spiritual gifts for personal gain. So that's the way the life was shaping up, and the Didache was trying to get a handle on this thing of who to give hospitality to and not give hospitality to. Similar rules applied to Christians in general. Christians in general were not to make gain out of the name Christian. So when we look at these texts, obviously there was a lot of abuse in the early church and later on by traveling preachers and teachers and missionaries. Now, quickly, what about hospitality today? Circe is literally the crossroads of the world. In ancient Greece, the people who lived there in Delphi considered that place to be the exact center of the ancient world. If you want to know where the exact center of the ancient world was, go to Delphi, and they had a stone there, the Omphalos. The Omphalos was the navel stone. They were the belly button of the world, of the whole center of the universe, of the world at least. And to some people, Circe is the Omphalos of the world. Well, I don't know about that, and we won't go into all of that. But I'll tell you one thing we can be sure of. Circe has a lot of people, and I think Steve had already mentioned it. We have lots of people coming through, lots of students coming through, and they're passing through this town. We have many foreign students who attend Harding and other universities and colleges in our area, and they're away from home and they're lonely, and they would love some home-cooked food. I know some of you here have taken a lot of the Chinese students into your homes. But this is a great opportunity to show hospitality to these students who are lonely and looking for just a good home atmosphere. And it's a great way to spread the gospel. In Circe, the annual lectureship brings many strangers and friends to our city. That's not to speak of traveling chorale groups, sporting events, special speakers who are brought in. You know, it gets so tight that you cannot find a motel or hotel within 50 miles of Circe. Did you know that? You can't find a place to lay your head between here and Little Rock. And what a great opportunity it is to show hospitality to strangers. And speaking of our churches where we're members, how many Christians sit on that side of the building or that side of the building and you hardly even know these folks? You don't know who these folks are. You see them, I don't know who these folks are. Well, showing hospitality is a golden opportunity to get to know some folks in the home church that sit on the other side of the building from you. And by the way, speaking about our local churches here, we can learn a lot about hospitality from the hospitality industry. Do we have anybody here who works in the hospitality industry? Anybody here? Well, maybe you will one of these days. But I tell you this, Delta Airlines and other businesses, hotels, are keenly aware of the value of showing hospitality, the value of making people feel welcomed and feeling a part of the family. Don't we want to do that when visitors come to our churches? To make them feel welcomed and honored and a part of the family. Well, that's what the hospitality industry does, if we're good at it. In order to get repeat business, Delta and other companies are turning to none other than Mickey Mouse. That's right. Turn into Mickey Mouse. The Disney Institute is one of the largest consulting groups in the world for hospitality training. And they stress in their training these qualities in people: the need for kindness, acceptance, friendliness, and respect toward others. And you know, if you do those things in the business, people are pretty likely to come back and give you repeat business. And I suspect if we do these things in the church, we're likely to get people to come back and visit with us again. You know, as elders, and I'm kind of talking about us a little bit here, as elders, I think we can do a better job of training our people to be proactive in showing hospitality. And not just depend on the Welcome Center to carry the load of being hospitable, or a few extroverts that we post at the doors to carry the load, you know. We need to be proactive in our churches in showing hospitality and not just be the job of a handful to do it. Well, the benefits of hospitality are great. You can make some lifelong friends doing this. We often have people in our home who are visiting their children at Harding. In fact, we have several folks on their way. They may be at our house now, I don't know. But they're coming. And our air conditioner broke down, folks. I hope, and I'm praying, the man's coming at 7 o'clock in the morning to fix our air conditioner, and I'm hoping and praying it'll get fixed, folks. But a few years ago, we had some folks from Hawaii who had a son, Matt, who was at Harding. And so they needed a place to stay, and we said, well, you can stay with us. Well, they came that time, and they came a few other times, and we got to know these people real well. And sure enough, they said, well, when you come to Hawaii, you stay with us. Aloha! See ya! Hey, Sherry, put that on the list, please, honey. Well, aloha. And then there was Kevin Benebe. Do some of you remember Kevin Benebe? I think Kevin came to this church, didn't he? Well, let me tell you a story about Kevin. Kevin, when he got ready to graduate, Sherry and Kevin were talking, and Sherry said, well, if you need a place to stay when your family comes for your graduation, well, let us know, and we'll have a place for you there. Well, as it worked out, they already had a place lined up. But a big problem developed when they went to this house, and this house was filthy. It was not doable. There were underwear and stuff and dishes and hadn't been cleaned. So that's when we came into the picture. One night about 11:30, we were about ready to go to bed. Kevin called, and he said, man, we need a place to stay. About 10 minutes later, our doorbell rang, and Kevin was there with his sister, 2 brothers, and a niece. They desperately needed a place to stay. There was nothing between here and Little Rock. So we took them in. We found sleeping places all over our house, and we became really good friends in a few days there. I don't know if you know this or not, but Kevin's sister, the one that came, is a lawyer there in the Bahamas. She is a member of the House of Parliament. I don't know if maybe you knew that. His father was a member of the House of Parliament and is a very, very important political figure in the Bahamas. They showed us some pictures of their house. I'm telling you, folks, their house is like a mansion. I mean, it is like a mansion. You would not believe how beautiful that house is. And they said, when y'all come to the Bahamas, stay with us. We got that on. Sure, you got that on the list too? Huh? Hey, look, we're going to go one of these days. We haven't done it yet. But this is one of the side benefits of hospitality. And I hope you won't misunderstand me. Sherry and I are not poster children for hospitality, and we need to improve a lot in this area, but we're trying our best to do what we can. And some of you are much better examples of hospitality than we are. But many years ago, we decided that our house is not really our house. This house does not really belong to us. It belongs to the Lord. And we're going to use that house the very best we can to serve the Lord. Well, in closing, it's time. I've already mentioned the hospitality of Jesus. I've already mentioned Matthew 25 as kind of a test case for our own hospitality. But I think that we see the Lord's hospitality more in John 14 than in any other place. In John 14, 1 through 3, Jesus said, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also